do this distinction domestic versus whatever Jewett is doing, right? So I think if you want to break it down that way, or maybe not in terms of two different viewpoints that are in conflict or at odds, but just two different sides here, you can say there's the domestic, which is moral and religious, and is teaching you lessons, versus Jewett, that is secular and high culture. I'm just using basically the terms they use throughout here to describe her. So for the domestic, they talk about lessons in the first paragraph, even they start off there talking about the struggle to instill a mother's values, line 12 is an example there. So their future the children, that's another thing you could add if you wanted to, that's unique, more unique to the domestic versus Jewett. I'm basically taking the information that presented over the course of the passage and dividing it into those two groups. We have Jewett in line 19 saying almost wholly secular world. And they say, line 24, secularization again, as potentially tying what Jewett is doing into broader trends. In lines 33 to 35, they're talking about domestic novels having multiple purposes, a novel, child-rearing manual, tract on Christian duty. Then later they say those didactic aims are absent in Jewett's writing. So again, the domestic novel is teaching you lessons, it's didactic, and Jewett is secular and high cultural. I'm mainly just walking away from the passage with those two groupings, those distinctions, and that's really all I think you need. Aside from the fact that there are these critics who think that Jewett falls within the domestic, and in reality, the author believes her to be separate from domestic, and Jewett herself supposedly intended this as well. So if you want the author's opinion, you can simply summarize it as Jewett is not domestic. Well, like, as if saying her work does not fall within the category of domestic novels, it's something else altogether. If you walk away with one thing, that's what I want you to take away from this. And they're basically just making that argument over the course of the entire passage. I don't think there's really any wonderful way to separate this in terms of even the paragraphs. They're giving you more details on each of those two groupings throughout. I do think there's a very nice summary at the end here about, in lines 44 through the end, that kind of crystallizes everything. Saying that unlike domestic novelists, Jewett does not have an agenda. They are, the Jesus likes the works for what they are. It's high culture, no agenda on her end.
Yeah, on the side I just wrote ended in itself.
Yeah, it's ended in itself, exactly. So that's lines 50 to 51 right there. So let's run through the questions. And once again, I would want to do the general global ones first, then the local ones, then the inferential ones. So looking here, I would say I would want to knock out 22 and 25 first, for sure, since they're basically asking the same thing. Maybe 22 is a little bit more detail-oriented than 25. Then 26 is organization, but specific to paragraph 2. I might do that next. Then I'm going to just do all the rest. So let's start with 25, which is the most global of all, and I think that can, in a way, help crystallize our understanding of the passage. So primary function, what's the purpose? Why did the author write this? What are they trying to get across? Well, it's really just this. Jewett's novels, Jewett's work, does not fall within the category of a domestic novel. That's really what they're looking to say. So it's not within camp 1, it's the secular, it's not cultural, it's something else altogether. Any choices line up with that? A?
E.
So we got E, and then one person saying A. B. Okay, so we got all different choices here. A says a radical redefinition of several historical categories of literary style. We have a radical redefinition of several different things. I don't really see support for that. There is the question of how to define Jewett's work specifically, but I don't think we're redefining categories overall. So I would knock out A for that reason. B, one writer's work is a paradigmatic case. So is Jewett's work used as an example to illustrate something overall? I think it's really focused on her specifically. It's not really using her as a zoom out and say something in more general terms. But E, rejecting a particular way of classifying a writer's work, rejecting her way of saying that she's within the domestic novel category to say that she's instead something else altogether, more within the high culture. So E's an action there. Tricky question. People definitely, I did see a lot of other people choose A and B. Let's look at 22. What question is the passage helping to answer? No way to rephrase necessarily, of course, but I would say the question they're answering is, where does Jewett's work fall? So I'd probably expect an answer choice that references Jewett in particular in some way here. So I'd start by looking at D and E. E says, what region of the US? They don't ever specify what any region in particular. You can just scan it. I'd look for pronouns. Are they mentioning the southeast, southwest, a particular state? They mention the US specifically in line 3, and then line 41 to 42, but I don't see any reference to a particular portion of the US. They talk about migration from rural to urban, but not really anything in particular. But D, what's an effect her conception of literary art had on her fiction? So this is her opinion of her work. We have this once again in the second half of that final paragraph. Jewett intended her works, lines 49 to 50. How she intended her works, what her purpose was, and what the impact was on her fiction specifically. And looking a little bit above that as well, fiction came to be seen as pure art, so I think this is a pretty good match here. Then the other ones, I think, are almost non sequiturs. A, talking about men, that's definitely out of left field. They don't really cover men at all here. C, the question of migration. Migration does come up, but they're saying here that actual migration is not really significant. They said 24 to 26, such factors may help to explain the differences. It can be argued that it represents something different altogether. So saying migration really isn't that impactful. So D for that one. Then looking at 26, the organization question, specific to paragraph 2, you might want to look back and just get a general overview of what paragraph 2 is doing if you want. Explain domestic novels. Then saying that some of those characteristics are absent from Jewett's work in particular. So we have the two sides. Is Jewett's work within domestic novels or not? I look for something that's talking about two sides, which of course many of them do. A says unity of the phenomenon. There's no unity going on here. B says incompatible. Showing that two hypotheses are incompatible, then giving reasons for preferring one of them. You could say there are two hypotheses, Jewett's work is within domestic novels or not, but they don't really draw such a clear yes-no distinction here overall. And they're saying towards the end that she doesn't intend her work. They're saying specifically one reason didactic aims are absent from Jewett's writing, which is instead within high cultural. So I think that looking at the end of the second paragraph, it's not saying that we clearly want to prefer one side. They're not drawing a conclusion till later, or at least summarizing their conclusion till later. So I knock that out too. Looking at C, several hypotheses, and saying they're not really distinct. There aren't really several hypotheses. There are only two overall in the passage. But again, the conclusion is not to say that they are not different. Of course, they are different. D, even just saying classificatory. they're not really, as a whole, the passage may be classifying things, but within passage 2 specifically, they're just going into depth on what domestic novels are, then concluding that Jewett does not fall within that. So bringing us to E, we have different hypotheses. First, about the urbanization over time, then the domestic novel versus what Jewett's doing. And so the author is advocating to say that Jewett is not within this category. So E. Any questions on this? It's really just giving potential reasons why Jewett's work does not fall within this category. Let's go on to the rest, 23. Author most likely to view the recent criticism mentioned in line 1. So the recent criticism is the side that's saying that Jewett does fall within the category of domestic novels. And of course, the author of this passage doesn't like that idea. So we want something that's negative, but still considering it and then arguing against it. But the author overall just doesn't like it. I look for a negative term. So A, advocating it's essentially correct, far too strong in the positive. We want it to overall be negative. True claim, but for the wrong reasons. They're not saying it's a true claim. They're saying that it's incorrect. C, based on reasonable evidence and initially plausible, but ultimately mistaken. I think the reasonable evidence is that second paragraph once again, where they talk about the secularization being tied to the urban migration. So, but then ultimately concluding towards the end that it's not within it, line 49 once again, thus unlike the domestic novelists. So C is a good fit. D, it is questionable. The author would certainly view it as questionable, but relying on a currently dominant literary aesthetic as if that's the reason why. It may be recent, and so it's current for that reason, but that's overall not really what the author's focus is on here. And as to whether it's dominant or not, we don't really know necessarily. And the goals of fictions are out of left field. It's not covered at all. Then E, no support, and therefore worthy of dismissal. They would dismiss it, but again, the support in paragraph 2 functions as a kind of counter premise for the author's opinion. So C is the answer on that one. Any questions on this? All right, 24. Domestic fiction being based on a conception of fiction as a continuum. As part of a continuum, line 30. So go to line 30, read through context above and below a little bit. And we said they're discussing the domestic novel as part of a continuum, that includes fiction and these other things, piety, domestic instruction, morality, and so on, all these things. Domestic novel is part of fiction along this entire spectrum. And so what's the author's agenda here? It's to say that fiction, the lines between fiction and other genres are blurry. The spectrum is what can be included in a genre versus not. We're saying it's not a yes-no thing, it's a little bit more complex than that. And so, A, I think is misinterpreting the word continuum to be time-based. It's not time-based here, it's genre or feature-based in a way. So B, fiction not clearly distinct is a good match. What's fiction, what's not, what's domestic novel, what's not, what's religious, what's not. The lines are blurry, domestic novels are blending a lot of these different things. So B is a good fit for this one. C says serial form. I think once again that's based on a misunderstanding of the continuum idea as being time-based, where there's an order in which things occur. D, constantly evolving. Yes, fiction may be constantly evolving, but again, this is not a time-based continuum. It's in that particular moment, the writing of that time, some things were fiction, some were within fiction, some were domestic novels, some were other things. There was a mix of some being religious, some being secular. You could have anything within that category. Then E, cohesiveness and continuity of society. that may be true. E may be true technically, as it must be true, but that doesn't relate to the continuum idea specifically. So B is our answer on this one.
That E1 was like a trap. So I think it was trying to get you to like take the ideas of like morality and religion and like combine it with this cohesiveness and continuity thing.
Yeah, I do think that domestic fiction certainly serves that function. So E is technically correct, but I think that I can see why that's tempting for that reason. But then going back to 30, fiction part of the continuum, including these various things in a particular moment. So yeah, I think E is like I guess the right answer to the wrong question. It must be true, but not answering what 24 is asking. Then finally, 27. Different conceptions of fiction held by Jewett and the domestic novelists. Answer what? So this is a bit more of reading between the lines. I think that since it says held by Jewett specifically, that should orient us towards the end of the passage where we have Jewett expressing her opinion. Once again, in lines 49 to 51, we're in lines 40, specifically covering her opinion, and then looking more broadly up to line 44 on this conception, it's also covering how fiction is viewed by everyone, domestic novelists included, and how things may have changed over time. So looking back at that paragraph, specifically that portion of the paragraph, what does it answer ultimately? Thoughts?
C.
Yeah, awesome, C, exactly. So Jewett doesn't have to do those things because she's not part of the domestic novel group. She is doing her own thing, high cultural, secular, not bound by those constraints, as the domestic novelists were. That question?
I was kind of confused between A and C because A was unwilling and C was not constrained.
Yeah. Yeah, I think A is tempting, but the unwilling does make it wrong. Was she not willing to, or did she just not choose to? She had other ideas in mind. Unwilling is a little strong for this. Then E saying unable is also kind of speculating as to her reasons. We don't know necessarily why she didn't include them. It seems that she just had other ideas in mind for what she wants to include in her work. But saying she was unwilling in A or unable in E is adding something to her her motivations that isn't present in the passage. Anything else? Nice job. It's a tough passage. Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them, and feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.